The Force. Authentic.
Oh, I think we're taking a few G's here.
I can't feel my face. I'm numb. The sensation. Real.
I can't lift my hand. Is there still gravity?
The experience. Unbelievable.
Dad, are we still in the building?
New Mission Space at Epcot. Like no thrill on Earth.
Opening in 2003, Mission Space was set to be the biggest, boldest, and most ambitious addition of the century to the Epcot park, combining thrills with an authentic astronaut experience to offer a one-of-a-kind, out-of-this-world simulation ride. But how, with a multi-generational audience so entranced by the idea of space exploration, could this $100 million ride turn into one of Disney's most intense yet skippable attractions in the park? Is it so disliked because it replaced something so beloved, or is it because it's truly an unbearable experience? And how on earth has this particular ride, with a reputation for short lines and motion sickness induction, survived so long? Hi, I'm Jo, and let's do a deep dive to find out the answers to these burning questions. But before we begin, if you're interested in theme park history and other fun similar stories, be sure to subscribe to my channel and turn on your notifications so you don't miss out on any of the upcoming videos. Without further ado, let's start right back at the beginning, a quarter of a century prior to the ride's opening, 1977. When Epcot was first proposed as a theme park as part of Master Plan 5, it was set to feature a number of pavilions, many of which the park would open with, and others which didn't make the cut. Familiar opening day attractions including the Land and World Showcase graced the list, as did those which would materialise within the decade following opening, notably the Living Seas and Life and Health, which would manifest in the form of the Wonders of Life Pavilion. Of the 8 pavilions mentioned in the master plan, only one would fail to appear before the turn of the century, the Space Pavilion. The Space Pavilion was one of the least developed pavilions in the master plan, described only as a huge interstellar space vehicle which would transport passengers to the outer frontiers of the universe, highlighting man's efforts to reach for the stars around him, from the early pioneers who looked and wondered to the modern-day space travellers and their triumphs, to the challenges and possibilities of future space technology and exploration, which objectively gives you nothing. The pavilion's concept was worked on by the acclaimed science fiction author Ray Bradbury, most notably known for his dystopian novel Fahrenheit 451 and The Martian Chronicles. However, over time the concept was reshaped and morphed. In subsequent mentions over the next few years, they reined in their ambitions for the pavilion, with the once interstellar universe-spanning attraction instead taking passengers to the edge of the universe in a journey that highlights efforts to reach the stars, before once again uprooting these plans in favour of a new space development. Featuring a space station and Omnimax sphere attraction, this new concept was demonstrated with a very similar spherical model to that of the original Space Pavilion plan, and featured a rocket ship and a huge glass window which appeared to overlook an outer space scene. While the Omnimax sphere attraction dubbed Future Probe would be developed further, the space station did not find its way into the park and disappeared entirely from concepts. So when the park opened in 1982, it was without a Space Pavilion, despite its mention as late as the 1980 annual report. In 1983, however, one part of the Space Pavilion would debut in the park, Future Probe, which had since mercifully been renamed to Horizons. Horizons was reportedly originally intended to use a curved Omnimax screen in its final ground scene, the same one proposed in the aforementioned Future Probe concept. Despite Imagineer Bob Gurr's lobbying, in execution the ending scene simply utilised General Electric projectors instead. The other part of the Space Pavilion, the rocket-driven journey to the far corners of outer space, did not emerge. While the theme of space was also explored within the park in Spaceship Earth, that was the extent of it for the next 20 years of operation, until in the mid-90s it was announced that Horizons, the other space-coded attraction, would close. Horizons had a bit of a bumpy road towards the end, with the ride originally closing in 1994 but then reopening in 1995, which is basically unheard of nowadays. Though shortly after this reopening it was announced that the beloved ride would close permanently, being replaced by this new high-tech ride. On a side note, one thing we'll learn about Horizons as we cover it more is just how dedicated the ride's fan club was. So when its closure was announced, it upset a lot of people. Rumours swirled about the reason for its closure, citing everything from massive underground sinkholes to low visitor numbers, but regardless of the reason, the ride's removal would leave a big, space-themed hole in the park, and a bitter taste in people's mouths. Ultimately, Horizons' final day of operation was January 9th, 1999. The Disney company was very quick to announce the ride's replacement in a Horizons demolition ceremony in April 2000, again something which is completely unheard of nowadays. The ceremony was hosted by Al Weiss, president of the Walt Disney World Resort, and Michael Capellas, CEO of Compaq Computer Corporation, who would serve as the sponsor for the new ride for 12 years. During this ceremony, they not only launched fireworks from the roof of the Horizons building, but also projected the word space onto the side of it, really hammering the point home. And construction began quickly on the new Space Pavilion, starting in the autumn of 2000, almost immediately following the demolition of the previous attraction. Despite the disappointment, it felt almost fitting that as a consequence of Horizons perishing, the long-awaited and rumoured final entry to the Space Pavilion would emerge in its place. Construction of the ride progressed quickly, and Disney announced that the replacement ride would be so large it would outsize the current show building, justifying the need for that demolition of the once iconic architecture. The new ride, now dubbed Mission Space, would allow riders to venture into deep space, offering guests a one-of-a-kind astronaut experience by launching them into a simulated space adventure which would feature a pulse-racing liftoff, outer space weightlessness, and a series of sustained G-forces, which would be achieved through the use of a centrifugal system. The attraction was designed in association with NASA advisors, former astronauts and scientists, with Disney approaching the company in 2001. Disney Imagineers toured the Johnson Space Center's facilities, experiencing mission control in the Advanced Spacesuit Laboratory as part of their research, and the two parties collaborated to create a product rooted in realism, considering the challenges of stepping beyond the lower Earth orbit. They also consulted NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory team for satellite images of Mars and its terrain, and discussed the future of rocket propulsion technology, considering this in the design process. Interestingly, in the 2000 annual report, Michael Eisner described the attraction as an important example of how the Disney company continued to build for the future throughout the economic downturn, and explored how the ride would contribute to an enhanced product with increased operational efficiency. This development and economic crises approach could explain why, despite the promise that Mission Space would be larger than Horizons, it ultimately ended up being significantly smaller. But with a capacity of 1,600 people per hour, it definitely does aid operational efficiency, but nowhere near as much as its predecessor, which had a capacity of over 2,700 passengers per hour. The dedication ceremony for Mission Space was attended by multiple astronauts who reportedly told Eisner it was the closest thing that they've seen to blasting off from Cape Canaveral. One notable and very qualified rider in the early stages was Buzz Aldrin of moon landing fame. At the time of opening, guests would enter through one main queue with options for single rider and fast pass into the first room, known as the Space Simulation Lab. Narratively, this lab was located within the International Space Training Center, also known as the ISTC, a 45,000 square foot building featuring a curvilinear exterior. After being greeted by a 35-foot tall turning gravity wheel upon entry, they'd see an authentic Apollo-era lunar rover overhead, which was on loan from the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Guests could also see models and informative graphics of the X-1 and X-2 spacecraft they were about to board. Next up was the Training Operation Room, which featured large monitors playing videos of the ISTC training sessions. Guests would then meet a dispatch officer in the team dispatch room and be assigned one of 4 roles for their mission: commander, pilot, navigator, or engineer. From there, they'd go into the ready room and then to the pre-flight briefing, which was inspired by the real white room at Kennedy Space Station. In the case of real launches, this is where astronauts wait to board their spacecraft. And as if there hadn't already been enough briefing, guests would receive one final briefing before entering their ride vehicle, known as the X-2 trainer. In a simulated launch and flight experience, riders would experience realistic sounds, sensations, and sights similar to those experienced by astronauts in flight. The computer-generated videos playing were based on the data retrieved from NASA's satellites, which use photorealistic images. After boarding, guests would be launched into space, take a brief hyperspace nap, and progress through to a Mars landing. The ride had the feeling of interactivity with buttons and control joysticks, but actually operated without consequence, as regardless of if the buttons were pressed or there were actually riders in the assigned roles, the video would continue to play and the story would be resolved. The ride featured many references to its beloved predecessor Horizons, with the old ride's logo placed at multiple points throughout the attraction. The original marquee holder in front of the ride was also repurposed into a planter, which still stands today in the Planetary Plaza area. Offered in the 2001 annual report, Michael Eisner's glowing review of "no comment other than to say I'm still walking" perfectly captured the general reception to the new ride. In later press releases, however, Eisner reframed his experience, describing it as a unique, realistic attraction with a compelling story, dubbing Mission Space an e-ticket ride and grouping it with other park classics including Space Mountain and Pirates of the Caribbean. But as we said, Eisner's first review seemed to be more reflective of the general consensus, as it was intense. The ride reportedly offered forces of 2.5 Gs, which is more than twice the force of gravity pressing on your body at any one time. Other rides in the park do offer higher forces, including Space Mountain and Expedition Everest, but when you mix the force with the motion simulation and the video screens, you can see how this is a recipe for disaster. So while the ride offered an operational warning regarding intensity, many riders were unprepared for the attraction they would face. From the first day, there were complaints about the intensity of the ride, and this continued to be a recurring concern throughout its operating life. Some of the highlight reviews of the ride I found included, "I did not know I was claustrophobic till I went on this ride," "This ride ruined my vacation," and "Ride at your own risk." Other reviews described the ride as a coffin, panic-inducing, and a near-to-death experience. One early review brutally described the ride as forgettable and destined to become outdated as a result of its technology, and others accused it of excluding and isolating large portions of the Disney audience due to the intensity, with guests experiencing prolonged and lasting nausea and lightheadedness. It is also important to note that throughout the ride's lifespan there have been a number of tragic and upsetting reports of hospitalizations and required medical attention, for conditions including fainting, difficulty breathing, irregular heartbeats and chest pains. Additionally, in 2005, a 4-year-old with an undiagnosed idiopathic heart condition tragically passed away after riding. But despite all of this, the ride still has a lot of fans and has done since the beginning, even if I was selective in my initial reviews. While some did struggle with the intensity, many guests loved it and the associated thrills, describing it as the best flat ride ever, with the only complaint being they wish it was longer. Disney would address concerns about the ride's intensity over the years, starting with a few months after opening when motion sickness bags were added to the ride, and subsequently introducing 2 types of missions, green and orange. While the orange mission would use the original operating system, the green mission was a lot gentler, albeit still a bit rough for some, and is best described as a non-spinning version of the ride. The split intensity ride operating system is still in place today, although in 2017 they did do some mission updates just to kind of smooth out the system and change the video. But prior to this update, the future of the ride was uncertain, so let's go back to 2015. Something we'll discuss a lot in these videos is the impact of losing a sponsor, which is for some reason aggravated within Epcot. Depending when you're watching this video, this is something we will or have discussed in relation to the Wonders of Life Pavilion, which saw a rapid decline following the departure of its sponsor. To summarise, a lot of the Disney parks were or still are sponsored by third-party companies, who provide the capital necessary to fund the development, construction or expansion of an attraction or land. Sometimes when an attraction sponsor chooses to no longer sponsor said attraction, things go badly. Yet, strangely, this just wasn't the case for Mission Space. In fact, the complete opposite occurred. After Hewlett-Packard, aka Computer and Technology Goliath's HP, merged with Compaq, the Space Pavilion sponsor in 2002, they assumed the existing sponsorship. The original sponsorship was part of a 10-year only collaboration, but it's reported that the sponsorship was actually maintained until 2015 when the collaboration concluded, making it about 13 years. So why hasn't Mission Space closed down yet? As we said, typically when a ride sponsor is removed, it falls into a quick decline, and yet 9 years on, Mission Space is still operating and is still maintained to a high standard. In consideration of previous cases, after losing its sponsor, Mission Space should have also experienced staffing and maintenance cuts before slowly fading into obscurity and being quietly closed. However, after closing in 2017 for an extended renovation, the ride actually opened back up and has continued to operate since, once again something which feels almost entirely unheard of. Since the ride's opening in 2002, its neighbouring Wonders of Life Pavilion has died an uncivilised death, and as I said, you can hear more about that in my Wonders of Life deep dive video. The adjacent e-ticket ride test track has undergone 2 major overhauls, and Ellen's Energy Adventure was mowed into the ground and replaced with an entirely new ride, Guardians of the Galaxy Cosmic Rewind. But Mission Space, this turn-of-the-century simulator ride with its own dedicated sick bags, is still here. But why? The queues aren't ever particularly long, the attraction is regarded as mid at best by most visitors, and the ride is steadily approaching its 30-year mark, which is a long life for a ride reliant on technology, especially for simulator rides, which are notorious for aging poorly. So, considering this, how is it that Mission Space has survived when so many others have fallen? I do have one theory, and one theory alone: Space 220. I think post-sponsorship, the ride would have had 5 years maximum left, with the renovation maybe 10, taking us up to 2027. However, Space 220, a restaurant basically attached to the ride, completely upheaved and extended the ride's anticipated lifespan. If you've ever been to Space 220, you'll know that it's quite a cool experience, and reservations are still hard, if not impossible to get, almost 3 years after opening. I am about to discuss part of the experience, so if you haven't been just yet, skip to the timestamp in the description. Space 220 plays heavily into the Spaceland theme, and it too makes nods back to the original Master Plan 5. Upon entering the foyer, guests are given a ticket and taken up to the restaurant, which is located in the Centauri space station, in a space elevator known as a Stellarator. Once inside, the dining room boasts sleek, dark-toned curved design and a simulated viewing screen which wraps around the dining room, rotating through day and night scenes of outer space. The menu features space-themed dishes, including some of my favourite named dishes like the Big Bang Burrata and Starry Calamari. On this channel, we love a themed dining experience, and Space 220 is a great example of just that. It's a big experiential draw for visitors and locals alike, and elevates an otherwise mundane dining experience into something unique and special, which is fully immersive from start to finish. So what does this mean? How can a sleek, shiny space restaurant save an attraction from demolition? While it wouldn't be impossible, it would be a logistical nightmare trying to demolish the ride attached to the restaurant without massively interrupting the service and affecting the guest experience, and dare I say, disrupting the immersion. In addition to this, Mission Space serves as a narrative anchor for the restaurant, and while I'm sure this is less of a consideration, it's important to acknowledge how out of place a space restaurant would be next to, well, any other ride. It would just feel a bit weird, especially considering how well situated the other full-service restaurants are in the park. Think Rose and Crown in the UK Pavilion, or Coral Reef, which now sits next to Nemo and Friends, but at the time of opening was next to the Living Seas. Now imagine Space 220 next to anything that isn't space themed, and it just wouldn't be as effective. As such, my conclusion is that Space 220 is the only thing that's keeping Mission Space alive and running. So what comes next? To summarise, in my humble analysis, even if Disney did want to get rid of Mission Space, they couldn't, and that's a consequence of operating with a reactive short-term gain mindset. Space 220 is still, again, forgive the pun, it's just too good not to use, astronomically popular, and I assume will continue to maintain that level of popularity as one of Epcot's more family-friendly table service experiences for the foreseeable future. As such, Mission Space is both narratively and literally anchored in place. And maybe it's for the best. The ride is still popular enough despite being nauseating, and not only offers thrills seldom found elsewhere in Epcot, but, since the closure of Body Wars, offers a ride experience unlike any other in the park. While I'm personally not a massive fan of simulators or screens, I can acknowledge that other people are, and also the value of having them in the park to offer a completely unique experience far removed from the boat ride monopoly that currently operates in Epcot. In a utopian future, I imagine that plenty of people would love to see a Horizons return, and there's an element of viability there if the World of Motion inspired test track overhaul is well received when it opens in 2025. If Disney is playing into the nostalgia side of things in Epcot rather than the across-the-board IP integration, then maybe this is something that could come about, hitting both the narrative and the fan service marks. But alas, we're still facing the same problem of the painful success of Space 220. Later down the line, I can see the restaurant, the ride, and the adjacent Wonders of Life Pavilion being mowed down completely in favour of something new and potentially regrettably water-based. But for now, I think Mission Space is quite comfortable where it is, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So that's all for today. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to like it and subscribe to validate my efforts, and also let me know in the comments how you feel about Mission Space. Is it the best or the worst thing to come out of the early 2000s? And if it is the worst, what you'd like to see replace it. Thanks for watching, and see you real soon.